One thing I love about fantasy is all the different types of people. There's dwarves and elves and stuff who have their own culture and history that's not the same as with humans. It's pretty cool. And one thing I like about these fantasy races is noticing how they change over time. For a quick example, think of orcs. In Tolkien, they were a fundamentally evil race, which was kind of an unfortunate decision that even Tolkien himself was uncomfortable with. Modern depictions of orcs portray them as having the capacity for good. If orcs are evil, it's usually for cultural reasons rather than because they're just monsters who can never be redeemed. It's also a fun project to look backwards into the folklore that inspired Tolkien and see how things like elves and dragons evolved over time before they passed through the great funnel of Tolkien that inspired their modern depictions. Did you know that one of the reasons elves were associated with archery before Tolkien was that in English folklore they were believed to shoot disease at you? It was called an elf shot. Elves were these invisible beings who would shoot disease at you from a bow, like Cupid shooting love, except it's like fucking the plague. If you found that fun, then get ready, because I am starting a series, my first series on this channel, depending on what you count, where I do that with every fantasy race or creature, going over their origins and folklore, if and how they're used in Lord of the Rings, and then how D&D affected them, and finally looking at any interesting post-80s interpretations. Then after that, I want to end each video with some observations, advice to any writers or dungeon masters about which traits I find interesting or neglected, and what I would personally do to make my own version of the race, which honors what came before while bringing something new and exciting to the table. Now, why am I starting with halflings? Well, I think that halflings have had the biggest drop in significance out of every fantasy race that was introduced in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Hobbits were the main characters of both books. By rights, they should be one of, if not the, preeminent non-human fantasy race. But they're not. We'll talk about the extent and causes of that drop later, much later, but I'm of the opinion that if halflings don't get some sort of huge overhaul in modern fantasy, they're eventually going to just disappear. There's another reason I chose to do halflings first, instead of something more interesting like dwarves or vampires or dragons. And that's that halflings are relatively simple, and this is my first entry in the series. Halflings do not have that many modern depictions to parse through since, as I said, almost nobody uses them. But there's also nothing to talk about before the 1930s, right? I mean, Tolkien invented hobbits from whole cloth, so unlike dragons or whatever, halflings have less than a century of history. Easy peasy. Or that's what I thought when I started this. You saw the thumbnail. I implied there was something pre-Tolkien, and there's actually two things I want to talk about before 1930. After all, Tolkien didn't create his works in a vacuum. Portions of the story for The Hobbit are taken from Beowulf, dwarves and elves seem to have been inspired by Norse mythology, and Gandalf is more than a little reminiscent of Merlin. So was there anything like that with hobbits? Well, let's look into it. Tolkien talked about his writing process in a letter to W. H. Auden in 1955, called Letter 163 by Tolkien scholars. As an aside, this letter shows how little Tolkien had planned out. As an example, he mentions writing the scene at the Prancing Pony and introducing Strider without knowing who he was. My guy literally started writing Lord of the Rings and then came up with the idea of Aragorn on the fly, like one of the main characters of the series, and he didn't know that that character existed when he started. Isn't that insane? This is also the letter which mentions the tarantula thing. It made the rounds online as a meme, but if you didn't know, Tolkien was stung by a tarantula as a small child, and in this letter he mentions this incident and said it has absolutely nothing to do with the use of spiders as monsters in his works. Alright, bro, sure. Back to the matter at hand. The reason I read this letter in the first place is that Wikipedia told me it would shed light on one of Tolkien's inspirations for hobbits, and here it is. In the second footnote, Tolkien mentions that the hobbits were unconsciously sourced from a book called The Marvelous Land of the Snergs. Ooh, what's that? Let's go and read it. The Marvelous Land of the Snergs is a children's book from the 1920s about British children wandering through a fantastical hidden land. I liked the narration style and some of the humor, but I thought the story meandered and the fantastical elements were understated compared to literature that came later, most notably The Hobbit. I'm not going to do a full recap of the book, but a little world building is necessary. The story takes place on a landmass that has been conveniently hidden from modern humans through features of the surrounding currents and winds. The humans living there seem to be European and strongly resemble the English Middle Ages, or at least, a fairy tale version of it. There's kings and knights and stuff. These humans are not particularly important, and in fact, the main characters don't even know they exist at the start of the book, since they're all across a wide river that the main characters never bothered to cross before. Before the events of the book, this mysterious land is somehow discovered by an English woman named Miss Watkins, who does what every English person does when they see a new land, that being a cheeky bit of colonization. She sets up a campus of what she calls the Society for the Removal of Superfluous Children. That sounds pretty ominous, but it's actually a good thing. She and a group of women who work for her take English children out of abusive or neglectful homes and raise them on the hidden land. Two of these children will leave the safety of the central encampment and explore the greater area, which is the subject of the story. As usual, the British settlement was created on land that was already occupied. I already mentioned humans, but they're on the other side of that really wide river, so they don't matter. No one even knew they were there. The natives on our side of the river are the Snergs. Tolkien was not kidding. The Snergs are almost identical to hobbits physically. Their height is described as about the height of a table, which I find pretty unhelpful and hard to visualize personally. Fortunately, we do know the king is tall for a Snerg at 4 feet, and that most Snergs are about the same height as the child protagonists, although that one, like the table thing, is not helpful because we don't know the children's ages. Similar to hobbits, your average Snerg, despite being the height of a child, could not possibly be confused as one, since they're more broad and filled out. Snergs can grow facial hair, but judging by the descriptions and the illustrations, most of them don't. The only Snerg we do see with facial hair basically has long sideburns, so again, very hobbity. Physically, Snergs are tough, but also agile and dexterous. They are described as being able to climb like startled cats. Their personality and culture is less hobbity. The Snergs are portrayed as competent, but fun-loving and scatterbrained. Their architecture is distinctive for its many additions and odd shapes. This is because both during and after the construction process, the Snergs get distracted and build something new and unrelated on top of what they were doing before. Snergs love to party. They feast as often as possible and on any excuse. In fact, the king of the Snergs will sometimes order a servant to figure out if it's someone's birthday, for the sole purpose of using that as a pretense to throw a party. The Snergs enjoy hunting and are excellent archers. They are also very resistant to physical damage. Snergs live a long time. The main Snerg companion is 273, which makes him a young adult. We're given an upper limit in the books that 1,000-year-old Snergs are old gaffers, which led me to discover that gaffer is kind of a playful insult. Our main Snerg character is Gorbo, a potter who tasks himself with the care of the children when he finds them alone in the woods. Gorbo's heart is in the right place, but he is noted for being stupid and short-sighted. The Snergs are said to not be the cleverest of people, but Gorbo is especially so, referred to several times as the biggest fool among the Snergs. His gullibility and foolishness get him into all sorts of trouble. For example, a witch gives him what she says are a cap of invisibility and a magic sword, and tells him to kill the tyrant king. So Gorbo runs into a room believing he's invisible and smacks the king with what turns out to be just a stick, giving him a welt, or as the story calls it repeatedly, a stinger.
It's a good name. Sting.
The worst part is, the king was actually a good guy. The witch just hated him for petty reasons and because she's evil. However, the sense of responsibility Gorbo has for the children gives him a sense of duty and bravery, and toward the end of the story when the children are kidnapped, he alone figures out what happened to them. He also kills an ogre, which was really cool if you don't know the insane context that led to this situation. It's hard to say where the author, E.A. Wyke Smith, got the idea for these guys, so if we're looking backwards at short beardless guys, the trail kind of ends here. However, they're said in text to be probably a descendant of English pixies. In universe, the author is just wildly guessing, but it's a guess that the author chose to give us, so we should give it some credence. Maybe E.A. White Smith was inspired by English pixies when he created them. Finally, before we finish off, let's talk a little bit about why the Snergs exist narratively. The children need an adult companion who understands basic safety and knows how to navigate this strange land. However, that companion also can't overshadow them too much since they're the protagonists. At some point, their adult companion would just become a chaperone and they would stop being the heroes of the story. Thus, Gorbo exists. He's not a child, but he's not exactly an authority over them in the same way that a human adult would be. He's physically the same height as the children, and he's not smarter than them, so they all have to make decisions together. Okay, before we move on, I really do want to talk about the ogre. This has nothing to do with hobbits or halflings or Snergs even or anything, but it is so insane, the most insane part of this book. So when they accidentally cross the river, the children and Gorbo realize they need help, and Gorbo has heard of this ogre called Golithos who has reformed. He used to be a classic ogre that, at least, according to the author, all ogres eat children and are evil and murderous, but this ogre, Golithos, has reformed. However, they get to Golithos' house, and he sucks. First of all, he is like a pathetic wreck. Like, being reformed really doesn't suit him. He's like really apologetic and weak-willed, and he is on a vegetarian diet, which is criticized by the by the author as not being sufficient for the children. Anyway, the other thing that happens with Golithos is that he is tempted, like, he was an addict to eating children, and now that there are some children in his house, he's about to relapse. So Gorbo realizes this and takes the children away. But this isn't the end of the ogre's plotline. The witch, the closest thing the book has to a main villain, recruits Golithos to work for her, and in exchange, she'll give him the children to eat. So he's fully evil now. And then, Gorbo shoots the ogre dead. And then at the very end, after, we're wrapping up, there's this weird moment where the author says, it occurs to me that there is some difficulty in proving a really useful moral from this tale, because the children were acting out. They ran away and they did a lot of irresponsible things, but it all resulted in some really good stuff. Not only were the children okay, but they also bridged two societies. Like, it was great. Their bad actions had a good result. So this is a fun lampshading of, there's no really good moral for this tale. But then the author says this: so perhaps the only definite moral that can be deduced is, if you by any chance meet an ogre who claims to be reformed, pretend to believe him until you have got a gun and then blow his head off at the first opportunity. And Jesus Christ, Golithos is a thinking being, by the way. He's not like a beast. He is capable of changing. The author just thinks that, for once an ogre, always an ogre. There's no getting off the eating children train. And if someone claims they're reformed, then you should not even run away, not even disassociate them, blow their head off. I imagine you're already thinking of connections to Tolkien's Hobbits, but you're just going to have to let that sit for a minute while we talk about a different inspiration from Hobbits, one that Tolkien never admitted to. Tolkien was a lover of language, after all, so let's drill into the etymology of the word hobbit and see what we can dig up. See, Tolkien is credited with inventing the word hobbit, which, paired with his aggressive legal team, is why they're called halflings in Dungeons & Dragons. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because did Tolkien invent the word hobbit? Sort of. There is one mention of hobbits as a fantasy creature before Tolkien, from a strange pamphlet on English folklore published in the 1840s and 50s. The author, Michael Denham, speaks of a time in the past that England was overrun with what the pamphlet calls ghosts, and includes a long list of different spirits and creatures from English folklore. Among them are hobbits. I recognize some of these names, and these are not all ghosts, so maybe it just meant some kind of intrusive presence or spirit. Still, kind of weird that hobbits are called ghosts, huh? So, Did Tolkien read this random pamphlet, forget about it, and reproduce the word hobbit in his own stories? No, probably not. I think this is too obscure even for him. But I do think the reason two different authors came up with the word hobbit in reference to, like, a fantasy creature is that both of them, subconsciously, were remembering a different word, hob. Researching folklore is like hard, guys. It sucks because no one wrote anything down. There's no primary sources I can read. Although, let's be honest, I wouldn't want to even if there were. From what I can glean from surface level secondary sources, Hobbs are a type of household spirit, which are a relic of pre Christian household gods, probably. Household spirits are distinct from pixies and fairies and the like, but within the household spirit umbrella, all the names seem to me to be pretty interchangeable. Hob is just another word for brownie or goblin. In fact, hobgoblin is just a combination of hob and goblin, which were basically synonyms at this time. We're all household spirits here. Now, what is a household spirit? These are invisible, shape-shifting creatures that do your chores when you're not looking, unless you insult their work or give them clothes. More mischievous variants will sometimes play practical jokes on you. Generally, brownies are the nicer ones, and goblins and hobgoblins are more mischievous, but the lines are very blurred. Now, there's definitely some stuff to talk about with these guys, but I think that conversation is better served in a dedicated goblin video. So let's ignore most of this and see if there's any folklore which is about Hobbs specifically and not any other type of household spirits. And look at that, I found something. There is a story associated with a cave in Runswick Bay in North Yorkshire, England. Apparently, the belief was that a hob lived in this cave, called the Hob Hole, and the people of this region had a ritual of asking the hob of the Hob Hole to use its healing powers on their sick children. They would stand outside the Hob Hole and recite a mantra. There are a couple different versions, but it's along the lines of the following. Hob Hole Hob, ma bairn's gotten to kink cough, tack toff, tack a toff. For context, bairn means child, and kink cough is an illness known now as whooping cough, and I trust you to figure out the rest on your own. Now, Tolkien says the word hobbit just came to him out of nowhere, which seems like the perfect condition for his subconscious to come in and take inspiration from the folklore of his country. And also, the word isn't the only thing that suddenly came to him. Tolkien says that one day, out of nowhere, he wrote the sentence, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." Before he had even decided what hobbits looked like or what the story was about, Tolkien already knew that hobbits lived in holes. Interesting. So either Tolkien hadn't heard of Hobbs, and the two inventions of the word hobbit is just one of the craziest examples of convergent evolution of all time, or the guy who got bitten by a tarantula and said that has nothing to do with him using giant spiders as villains is not fully cognizant of his inspirations when writing. Assuming that Hobbs did serve as an unconscious inspiration for the word hobbit, you can see how they inspired some aspects of the Hobbit lore as well. Hobbits are known for their hospitality. Bilbo, for example, is an exceedingly good host, even for guests that he didn't know were coming and actively didn't want there. It's not exactly the same, but the Hobhole Hob would literally cure your sick child when you go to its house. So, that's kind of a good host thing to do. Maybe that was a reach. Hobbits are also known for being able to make themselves hidden to scamper out of sight of the big people. This lines up with Hobbs. As household spirits, they were sometimes said to be able to turn invisible, and even when they couldn't turn invisible, they could still hide really well, because the whole point of the folklore is that you can't see these things living in your house, so they have to be pretty good at hiding. This combination of benevolent but avoidant of humans is kind of a big thing with hobbits, especially their earlier characterization, and it lines up with Hobbs and not with Snergs. So, maybe Hobbs contributed something, I don't know, but it's good for the thumbnail, so whatever. Finally, we can talk about what I thought was going to be the beginning of this video, Hobbits. Hobbits are described in The Hobbit as being about half the height of a human, so about 2.5 feet to 3 feet. But then in Lord of the Rings, the range is 2 feet to 4 feet, so that about is doing some heavy lifting. 4'5" is a historic record height that is only surpassed by Merry and Pippin because of performance-enhancing tree juice, so that's a pretty solid upper limit. Hobbits are, quote, inclined to be fat in the stomach, although it's not clear if this is genetic or if this is just due to their indulgent diets. Their stealth is described as an ordinary sort of magic, but this is explicitly stated to be mundane in Fellowship. This stealth is described as an ability to hide quickly, so the only part that I'd say is an innate genetic skill is the fact that they move without making any noise. Hobbits are portrayed as having tough, hairy feet, for which reason they do not wear shoes. This is not dwelled on in the books, but it will be important later, so I should say there are 3 types of hobbits, subraces, as it were, with different historical origins. I would say this is some obscure Silmarillion shit, but no, it's literally right here in the prologue, along with all the other stuff I found. You just forgot about it, or didn't read it. It's all here, literally on page 4 of the copy I'm using. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller, and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stoors were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. You might have heard the description of Fallowhides being tall and slim and thought, hey, they're kind of similar to elves. And you're right, they're historically more friendly with elves. They're also more elvish in their activities. They, are better with music and reading. You also might have heard about the skin color descriptions and said, oh no, where are you going with this Tolkien? And if you thought that, your instincts were dead on. Yeah, the Fallowhides, which the ones with the fair skin, are often leaders or chieftains among the clans of Harfoots or Stoors. It's like, good lord, Tolkien, why did you include that? Frodo, Merry, and Pippin all have some Fallowhide blood in them, which makes sense given their aristocratic standing. Sam, as an average Joe, will probably be mostly Harfoot in ancestry, which makes sense given that some of his descriptions describe being somewhat brown in his skin tone. The Harfoots are numerous and salt of the earth and the perceived average hobbit, while the Stoors are more built and capable of growing facial hair, and they wear dwarf boots. And so obviously the Harfoots are more friendly with dwarves and the Stoors are more close with humans. For some reason. Yeah, I really don't know. I don't get it. Why did you make that decision, Tolkien? And if you're wondering, Gollum is more related to the Stoors than he is anything else. So we've got a kind of representative character of each type. Now there's 2 metatextual things that I want to say about hobbits, one of which is going to be an important theme to track, and the other of which is kind of Tolkien specific. The Tolkien specific thing is that the Shire in some ways is meant to represent a familiar world in contrast to the more fantastic medieval societies elsewhere in Middle-earth. The Shire has clocks and fireworks. They don't use swords or have kings. This is a well-documented thing. If you look into the themes of Tolkien work, that once you leave the Shire, you sort of travel back in time and lose those more modern sensibilities. This is also what happened in the marvelous land of the Snergs. The main boys, or the boy and the girl, the people, the characters, are living in an encampment that is up to the standards of modern England, but they go on an adventure and they meet knights in armor and kings and queens. This is effective in Tolkien's work where hobbits are the main protagonists because we can follow them on this journey and learn about the world along with them. However, this doesn't really work in later versions of hobbits for many reasons. First off, I don't know if Tolkien intended for the hobbits to have invented clocks. He certainly didn't invent fireworks. I mean, that was all Gandalf. But since we only see clocks and fireworks in the Shire, it makes the hobbits look like technologically advanced tinkerers and inventors. And this does not gel with Hobbit's usual characterization as being laid back and pastoral. And Halflings as tinkerers especially doesn't work in worlds where you have a bunch of other fantasy races who make more sense to having that trait. Like in D&D, gnomes are tinkerers. So you can't have two little guys that are tinkerers, right? So hobbits or halflings in D&D are not going to be that way. The other function of the Shire that I think is a thing, although I didn't check if other people had this interpretation, is that the Shire is the recent past, an idealized version of pre-industrial England. It's the normal world, but back in the good old days where we didn't have factories and war, and you could leave your doors unlocked, and everything was great. I'm being a little facetious here, because I think that Tolkien thought of the Shire as what the world was like when he was a child. The Shire represents innocence, the sort of innocence that we're protecting by defeating Sauron. This is why the scouring of the Shire is so shocking, because the Shire, thus far, has been blind to the horrors of the world. Remember when I said Snergs are short and simple because it makes them more relatable to children? Well, I think there's a similar but more complicated thing going on here. Hobbits are not eternally children, but in a way they do get to live their whole lives without growing up in the same way that we humans do. They can grow hairy and fat like adults, but they don't grow tall. This, by the way, is my theory about why hobbits don't wear shoes. Going barefoot in the grass is a very childlike thing to do, especially back in Tolkien's time. So hobbits never reach the point where they have to lock in, put their shoes on, and get serious. I intentionally didn't look into other arguments of how hobbits do or don't represent childhood to make sure that this was my own personal interpretation, so I could be way off the mark of how most people see hobbits, or maybe this is a stone cold take that the Tolkien scholars have been saying since the 50s. I really don't know. And, after I finish making this horrible video, I'm not going to find out. I'm so done with hobbits. I've been doing this fucking script for months and months. The final thing to talk about is Bilbo specifically. He is the Hobbit after all, and D&D specifically have kind of tailored their Hobbit race to just be Bilbo. Bilbo is a thief who is exceptionally good at stealth. His ring turns him invisible, which makes him even better at stealth than he would be otherwise. Notable here is that in The Hobbit, most hobbits are not thieves. They're stealthy, sure, but they couldn't pick a lock. They couldn't break into a house. Their stealth is mostly just good for running away. Bilbo can't pick a lock either. That's just something that'll be important for the next section. And another thing about Bilbo, the ring doesn't exactly turn him invisible, does it? It taps him into the Wraith world. So if you base your halflings off of just the experiences of Bilbo Baggins, you might want to give them an ability that turns them invisible. And more than that, maybe you want to give them access to a creepy, ghostly plane. This is it. This is what? If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been. Wait, this? This is the furthest away from home you've ever been? Yeah? What's the issue? Sam, we're in the middle of the Shire. This is not the edge. We're like 2 miles away from Hobbiton. Hey, the Hobbiton is the place to be. I'll bet nobody comes out here. Sam, Merry and Pippin are literally in that cornfield over there. I can see them. And they're not even on a trip. They're just stealing some lunch. How, everyone's been further than this. So Tolkien finishes The Lord of the Rings, and fantasy literature, at least concerning hobbits, enters a quiet period. Dungeons & Dragons won't get released until the 70s, so until then we're chilling, right? Well, there is one kind of weird thing in between, and this will kind of be a weird story. So I scoured the internet looking for different examples of hobbits and halflings to make sure I'm not missing any of the big ones. One of the places I went was the Wikipedia entry for the word halfling, and I scrolled down to this place, Other Uses, and let's just read it. Some fantasy stories use the term halfling to describe a person born of a human parent and a parent of another race, often a female human and a male elf. Why is the woman the human? Terry Brooks describes characters such as I don't know, Shea Umsford from his Shannara series as a halfling of elf-human parentage. So what we call half-elves today, because of D&D, were sometimes called halflings. In a different series, Jack Vance's Lioness Halfling is a generic term for beings such as fairies, trolls, and ogres, who are composed of both magical and earthly substances. So that's fine. And then we have in Clifford D. Seamack's 1959 story, No Life of Their Own, halflings are invisible beings in a parallel dimension who, like brownies or gremlins, bring good or bad luck to people. And wait, what the fuck? I'm sorry. These things, I don't want to just read a short story about some random weird alien things that live in a parallel dimension. Like that's clearly not relevant to this video, right? Then again, they're invisible, like Bilbo. They are related to brownies or gremlins, and Hobbs. And good luck is actually a really major trait of halflings in Dungeons and Dragons 10 years later. So I kind of feel like I have to talk about this. No Life of Their Own takes place in a small farming community on future Earth. For economic reasons, most humans in the area have left, and the town is mostly populated with immigrant aliens, like aliens from other planets, but they're also separately to that immigrants. The main character, Steve, has 3 alien friends, including the new kid on the block, Butch. The farm belonging to Steve's parents has been hit with a string of bad luck. It's hitting their family especially hard, but things have been bad for every farm in town, except the farm of a nasty old human named Andy Carter. He's been doing great. Nobody has an explanation for this until the new kid, Butch, sees that the Carter farm is full of invisible little aliens. Butch's father explains that these creatures are native to their homeworld, and they are off phase with reality, which is why they're invisible and intangible. They are called halflings, or, they have a name in an alien language, but halfling is a rough analog. They're called halflings because they're half in this world and half out of it. The only way they interact with the world is by adopting a sentient being, Andy Carter in this case, and bringing them good luck. It's not clear how they do this, but as for why, it's also unknown. But the prevailing theory is that halflings need a purpose since they have no life of their own, so they have to live vicariously through the human they're adopting. On Butch's planet, the policy is to shoot these creatures on sight, since good luck for just one person invariably causes bad luck for the surrounding area. All of the children of Butch's species can see the halflings, because children have a natural affinity to see the supernatural. Steve cannot see them, but that's because he's a human and his eyes are just biologically different. Butch's father believes that Steve, with some special glasses, would be able to see them, and since he's a clever little tinkerer, he just makes those special glasses and gives them to Steve. Although to be clear, adult humans, even wearing the glasses, still can't see them. It turns out, with the magic glasses, Steve can actually see more than Butch. He sees that the halflings can see the immediate future, and they take steps to prevent it. Andy Carter, for example, climbs up a ladder that the halflings can see is about to fall, so they run up and physically hold it up so it doesn't fall. So the halfling's ability to bring good luck is actually not that magical. It's just some minor precognition and elbow grease. We also learn from this that it's not the halfling's fault that bad luck happens to people other than their adoptee. It is suggested that the bad luck is just something that happens naturally to fill a karmic imbalance created by the halflings, but it's not actually their intention. Not much is revealed about the halflings' nature, except that they are intelligent and shooting them on sight is wrong. They come to an agreement with the townsfolk to divide their numbers and help out every farm. In exchange, the humans give them a bunch of free VR headsets. That's the conclusion of a different plotline that it's not important. So these halflings are clearly not the same as hobbits, and they don't really belong here, but they do share a lot of traits. The luck manipulation in particular is surprisingly similar to the halfling luck in Dungeons and Dragons. Also, they're small, they can turn invisible, and they're also, just like Bilbo when he puts on the ring, in an ethereal, ghostly phase. But alright, let's get back to the normal stuff. Before I start going through the history, I have to say that this is not first-hand experience of mine. The only Dungeons & Dragons that I've played is 5th edition, and my only exposure to earlier editions is some of the Dragonlance books, which will be covered separately because their hobbits are different, and the original Baldur's Gate, which I played like a little bit when I was 12 and I didn't even finish it. I think that I played a half-orc, but, needless to say, the experience did not tell me anything about halflings. For deeper lore, I've been using the videos of AJ Pickett, whose channel I'll link in the description. I want to give a special shout out to one of his main sources, the Complete Book of Gnomes and Halflings, which is a text belonging to 2nd edition D&D. Dungeons & Dragons halflings are extremely similar to hobbits, and in fact, they originally were called hobbits until the Tolkien estate sent them a cease and desist. They're small, hairy, but usually not bearded. They're usually portrayed as chubby, although that aspect is less prominent in later editions. Not all halflings dwell in hobbit holes, but there is an emphasis on the coziness and harmony of nature of their homes, wherever those homes happen to be. Halflings have an aptitude for burglary, since D&D wanted them to be like Bilbo. In early editions, this was done with a flat-out rule that halflings had to be thieves, but even in later editions, where you're encouraged to play whatever race you want, halflings will usually have bonuses to stealth and whatever skills you need to get your hands on someone else's money. In 5th edition, the one I played, you're really encouraged to play however you want, but halflings have a bonus to dexterity, which is the skill both for stealth and for picking locks. The 2024 edition, which I haven't actually played, but I've looked into it, really encourages that you play whatever race you want for any class, so it doesn't have racial bonuses to different ability scores. It does, however, give halflings their luck and an ability to hide, both of which are pretty good for being a thief. Some versions of D&D have sub-races, different types of each race that you can play that have different additional benefits. The original 3 halfling sub-races are Harefoots, Stouts, and Tallfellows. If this reminds you of the Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides, it's supposed to, and the sub-races have basically the same thing going on. Harefoots are the most common, Stouts are tougher and can grow facial hair, and Tallfellows are more dignified and elegant. A difference here is that Harefoots have a connection with humans, and Tallfellows have a connection with elves, and Stoors have a connection with dwarves. The origins of these subraces are somewhat ambiguous, but there's a strong implication that they have ancestry with their corresponding friendly races. So Stouts are similar to dwarves, in part because they straight up are part dwarf in their ancestry. A.J. Pickett goes as far as to say that halflings may have entirely come from intermingling between the main races, with each other and especially with gnomes. And he says the word halfling might even have referred originally to this mixed ancestry. This is actually a really cool origin story for a fantasy race, even if it doesn't really make sense for halflings because they're so short. It's not clear where AJ is getting this information, so it may be like super implied in the text, or maybe he's just theorizing, I don't know. The subraces have changed a little bit over time, with a bunch of additional variants like aquatic halflings coming up in different editions, but the only one with real staying power other than the big 3 was ghostwise halflings, mysterious forest dwellers with psychic abilities. In 5th edition, the main player's handbook only has 2 subraces, the Stout and the Lightfoot. The Lightfoot is stated directly to be an amalgamation of Harefoot and Tallfellow. The mixed ancestry origin is completely scrapped, except for a mention that some say Stouts have some dwarven blood. But the biggest thing that D&D halflings have, the biggest feature that they're known for in D&D, is halfling luck. This has been represented in different ways mechanically over different editions, usually with bonuses to saving throws. The way it works in D&D 5e is that you re-roll if you roll a 1 on the d20, just any time that you roll 1. For those of you who don't play D&D, you roll a 20-sided die whenever your character attempts a task that has a chance of failure. Your dungeon master chooses a number that you have to hit, and your character might have various bonuses added to whatever number you roll that might help you hit the target. However, if you roll a 1 on a d20, that is called a critical failure, and it means you automatically fail. Even if you have like a plus 10 to the roll, and you should pass the check, like mathematically, you fail. This makes sense intuitively. Like every task, even if you're really good at it, always has a chance of failure. Most dungeon masters like to spice things up by making the critical fail result in the worst possible outcome, or like an especially cruel twist of fate. When I'm running a game and someone rolls a 1 when they're trying to attack, I like to make them drop their weapon or even accidentally injure themselves. I hope this shows exactly how the halfling luck trait works. The luck will not win you the lottery. It's the kind of luck that protects you from the worst results. This is kind of how it works in No Life of Their Own. The halflings were not like, planting Andy Carter's crops for him, but they were protecting him from bad luck. Although, unlike in No Life of Their Own, halfling luck does not cause, their neighbors to have bad luck. I would talk about my experiences of people playing halflings at the table, but I don't have any. In 5 years of playing D&D, nobody has played halflings. I've never played one. I've never played with someone who was playing one. I literally have no idea. Which, I mean, that is indicative in of itself of how people feel about halflings. I don't have any hard data since, it's a tabletop game. But I found a couple polls online, and halflings generally rank at the bottom of the human-looking races. Out of the races in the player's handbook, the only ones that consistently rank lower than halflings are half-orcs, dragonborns, and gnomes. And even then, it's not every poll. Halflings are also the second least played race in Baldur's Gate 3, although I think that's a little biased for reasons we'll get to in a minute. I have some theories about why halflings are so unpopular in D&D in the modern time when they were more of a staple back then. First off, they still haven't shaken the thief archetype. This is a problem because rogues in modern D&D are usually associated with the edgy, knife-wielding assassin. When I played a rogue, for example, I made an edgy assassin who wore eyeshadow and had a dark past, and this just wouldn't work with halflings. I mean, maybe it would, but halflings are just inherently goofy characters. It's hard to take them seriously. And of course, you can play an unserious character in D&D, but I think that halflings are losing that role as well, but I'll explain why in the modern day section. Kender are a halfling analog in the Dragonlance setting of D&D. They're like halflings mechanically, but they're pretty different in their lore. Also, they are different in the people's perception of them, because Kender are absolutely hated.
Finally, we gotta talk about the Kender.
If you ever want to blame anyone, I would say blame Janet Pack and Tracy Hickman.
We're going to start with the Kender from Dragonlance. I'm sorry for the horror stories that I just brought back up for a lot of people.
I actually experienced Kender first as a child reading the Dragonlance books, so I never played D&D with them, and my experience is a lot more rosy and happy. So I think that Kender deserve some recognition. So that's how I'm going to be framing this section of the video, with my rosy bias about them. With the Kender, Dragonlance took an ambitious swing at a question that's been kind of hanging uncomfortably over halflings since their conception in a gaming format. How do you make a race that is inclined toward being thieves, but still make them lean towards the good guy heroic side? This, and I assume other reasons, is why the creators of Dragonlance leaned heavily into the childlike aspect when designing the Kender. Their name is literally a play on Kender, and they are said to resemble elvish children. They have a youthful absent-mindedness and a curiosity. Their thievery is reframed as basically like when a child walks out of the store with something because they forgot they had it, and also they don't really understand they did anything wrong. I can see why this would annoy people playing tabletop. The Kender personality does give the player a license to make their Kender character act really irresponsibly and then not take any blame for it. It's like, oh, my character didn't know any better. But I really like the Kender, and that's for 3 reasons. The first is pretty simple. I like when creators take swings at stuff. They could have just made Hobbits again, but they made something new, and I respect it. Secondly, I like Tasselhoff, the Kender character in the books that I read. I read the first 3 Dragonlance books when I was a kid, and I wasn't in love with them or anything, but I enjoyed them well enough. I think Tasselhoff was probably my favorite character at the time, since a lot of the more adult characters had plotlines that went over my head, and Tasselhoff was just a goofy guy, and, I got that. Looking back, I like that Tasselhoff had personality, other than just being a typical Kender. He really likes maps, for example. He collects them and enjoys drawing them, even though he's not that good at it. Probably my favorite scene, at least that I can remember, I didn't go back and read the books, was in the third book when Tasselhoff and his grumpy dwarf friend Flint are riding on Dragonback for the first time. Tasselhoff, who has never been this high up before, sees the sprawling landscape and is reminded of a map. So he takes out his stuff and he tries to draw a map based on what he's seeing before Flint tells him to knock it off. My final reason is that I like the skinnier halflings. As much as the chunkier hobbits are totally a vibe I can get behind, especially when they're portrayed as like bartenders and stuff, it doesn't make a lot of sense as an adventuring archetype. To be clear, I think halflings can and should have variety and look like whatever they want. But I think that if you're going to give halflings a build that they are predisposed to have, I think a species of lockpickers and pickpockets should be more lithe and skinny. It makes more sense as a visual representation of the kind of character you're expecting the halfling to play. And you might agree with me. The visuals for Kender have made their way into the mainstream. One of the Dragonlance design team mentioned this. We were also playing with a lot of traditional D&D concepts and trying to alter them. Tracy thought halflings were too cute and chubby and cuddly, so the Kender were born as being thinner, more wiry, and more cunning and streetwise, attributes that have since moved back over to halflings as well. I also like the cunning and streetwise parts, but that's harder to credit to Kender specifically. I've always thought of hobbits as being clever and mischievous, so I'm not including it as a bullet point, although I do like that aspect of them. And yeah, I think the cultural consciousness is currently split between the classic plumper halflings and the skinnier, wiry halflings. Anecdotally, I'll say that I consider the wiry build to be taking over. A lot of hobbits in the Peter Jackson movies are skinny as hell. If you look up halfling D&D and you ignore all the AI slop, the general impression I get is that the skinnier build is more popular. But I also like the larger, chunkier halflings. I think that archetype works really well as an NPC. It just makes less sense as a thief, which is, again, what halflings are expected to be. Okay, my final little intrusion. I want to say that for the next part, I'm going to be talking about hobbits in modern fantasy. And when I say modern, I just mean post-80s. Obviously, that is a long time. Actual modern fantasy would be like the 2020s. But I'll be honest, I haven't read that much fantasy from the 2020s. Most of the fantasy that I've read is from the 90s and the aughts. So I am not versed. I'm not an expert on what it means to be a modern fantasy. I don't know what's going on. I know a little bit about romantasy, but not from firsthand experience. So I am remarkably not an expert in this. I think that's okay with halflings specifically, because the whole point I'm making is that they're not very prevalent. There are some things like vampires where you really need to take a look at each decade in the 21st century to figure out what their evolution has been like. But with halflings, I feel like there hasn't really been any big historical moments since probably Kender. So that's what's going on there. Halflings, in my opinion, are losing the sauce. It's hard to talk about modern depictions of them without acknowledging the fact that there just aren't that many depictions of them. Kitchen sink style fantasies where there's 7 different sentient races are less common. Coming into the 21st century, fantasy increasingly has humans and maybe 1 or 2 non-human races. And halflings are just not going to make the cut. There's nothing, or not nothing, but there's less interesting things you can do. Halflings are so similar to humans, it's like, well, if we're going to only have one non-human people, why would you choose halflings when you could choose something like elves or vampires? Even among the more kitchen sink style fantasy, halflings are not a guarantee. Discworld was a series of books from 1983 to 2015, and Dungeon Crawler Carl is one from 2020 to present, and both of them try to put a unique spin on pretty much every fantasy thing that the authors can think of. Both series include either the thing or some sort of fun spin on dwarves, elves, vampires, werewolves, gnomes, goblins, and orcs, but not hobbits and halflings, not even an analog. In fact, the only big fantasy franchise that I'm aware of that has halflings and isn't Tolkien or D&D is Warhammer. I won't be talking much about Warhammer because I am just not a Warhammer guy. I know literally nothing. I didn't even know that Warhammer had halflings until I looked up, things with halflings in them. I'll have to look into Warhammer if I do an orc video because I feel like Warhammer has contributed to the conversation about orcs, but they haven't done the same thing to hobbits and halflings. I mean, let's be honest, I haven't heard of halflings in Warhammer. Let me know if I'm wrong, but all I know about Warhammer Halflings is that they are the Tolkien-esque chubbier build, and they are really good at making food, which I think is fun, but it's not much to talk about, is it? So what happened? Why does nobody want to put halflings in their stories? One reason is that as basically short humans, halflings are boring. Dwarves, for instance, are miners who live underground. Medieval technology, underground mining towns in a magic setting do not exist IRL. So there's a lot of room for different stories to have their own interpretations of how dwarf society would function. Halflings, on the other hand, are fun and innocent and cottagecore. There's not a lot of variety in how you can imagine that. Halflings are not especially magical, so in terms of world building, they really are just basically humans. If you've seen a human small town, you've seen pretty much everything halflings have to offer. Then in terms of characters, halflings have an issue with niche. This is why I've never played a halfling in D&D. Big, burly races can always be the tough guy character, and long-lived races can always be like the wise lore person. Halflings used to have the sneaky thief characters, but they've been pushed out of that position by sexy goths with knives. The default rogue in modern D&D just is a morally ambiguous criminal who wears eyeliner and murders people. Playing a wholesome thief like Bilbo or Tasselhoff in D&D, or featuring one in a story, is honestly a departure from the norm now. Which leads me to my next point, sex appeal. As time passes, fantasy is becoming increasingly romantic and sex-based. You don't have to like it, but a big part of the fantasy space in the 2020s is romantasy. Romances in a fantasy setting. If the setting of one of these has non-human races, they're usually going to be sexy races designed to look good for the human readers, probably as the love interest of the romantic lead. Not that these stories have to be overtly sexual, like some of them obviously include graphic scenes, but even a wholesome, family-friendly romance still wants the leads to be good-looking. So yeah, all romantasy is going to feature sexier non-humans. That's just what's going to happen. Dungeons & Dragons, as it gains more widespread appeal and moves into the 21st century, is also becoming more focused on sexiness. Baldur's Gate 3 speaks for itself on that front, which is why I think, by the way, the halflings are so not played in Baldur's Gate, is because they're not sexy, and you're very encouraged to make your character sexy. You cannot make halflings attractive. It's not because of their height. You can choose to make dwarves attractive, but both forms of halflings, the plump middle-aged guy and the literal child, are things that you can't and shouldn't make hot. I mean, the pub, big guy, if you're into that, that's fine. The only way to make halflings easy on the eyes is to make them humans, but scaled down. Which, as we mentioned, is boring. Because why are you not just being a human? The only way to make halflings, compete with humans in terms of sexiness is to just make them humans. And in that case, why are we not just dealing with humans? What are halflings bringing to the table? Let's have a little think about goblins. They should be running into the same issues as halflings, right? They're not sexy. They occupy a niche, that being low-level villains, that has become oversaturated. But goblins, unlike halflings, have a charm to them. They're little freaks. It would be fun to play a goblin in D&D in a way that it wouldn't be to play a halfling. On a similar point, goblins, unlike halflings, are visually distinct. Tolkien imagined his fantasy races as all pretty much being humans. But over time, especially with D&D, there's been a focus on making races really visually distinct. You can be a tiefling, a red devil guy with a tail and horns. You can be a dragon person. You can be a giant bird with arms. You can be like an anthropomorphic lion. Elves can fit into this because we can just really exaggerate the pointy ears. Dwarves can be imagined as incredibly broad, as wide as they are tall. So even without knowing their height, you would know that's a dwarf from the long beard and the build. But halflings are just short humans. They have nothing super visually distinct about them. So they need something distinct visually and something distinct culturally. What are you getting from halflings that you aren't getting from humans or anything else? So with that in mind, let's go into what I think is a good example of how to do halflings in the modern day. I did not read the manga for this. It's not that I was unable to. I considered it and chose not to. I already read a children's book and a short story, so, screw you. I don't want to. Also, I was really enjoying the anime. When season 2 comes out in fucking 10,000 years, I want to go in blind. So if you're a manga fan and there's anything else interesting about Half-Foots after season 1 of the anime, you can put in the comments. That is, if you can get through this section with me calling it Delicious and Dungeon instead of Dungeon Meshi, because I know some of you guys have strong opinions about that. Delicious and Dungeon is a manga that ran from 2014 to 2023, and an anime that premiered in 2024 and will have season 2 in late 2027, which sucks, especially since I watched it right as it came out. Delicious and Dungeon is a kitchen sink fantasy that pretty closely follows the classic races and classes associated with D&D. I mean, look at the main party. We have a human fighter, a human cleric, a half-elf wizard, a halfling thief, which, we're going to talk about, a dwarf fighter, and Izitsumi, who does not fit into a classic D&D trope, but she joined the party late and she clashes with the team, so it makes sense from a meta sense. Also, she is playing on a trope, just not a D&D one. These D&D tropes are mostly played straight, since the subversion of the show is all about the characters' priorities and their ways of dealing with situations, and the unique ways in which they cook and eat different monsters. Dwarves are bearded, helmeted, buff, and they mine a lot. Maybe there's more in the manga, but as far as the show is concerned, there's literally nothing about dwarves that is unexpected compared to, what we think of them in the modern day. You can't improve on perfection, after all. But Half-Foots, the halfling analog, are not just copy-pasted from halflings. Their biggest and most obvious thing that sets them apart from everyone is their lifespans. They become full adults at 14, and they tend to live to about 50. This is really interesting because in this world, humans are no longer the shortest end of the lifespan scale. The half-elf character, Marcel, grapples with the fact that, all things being equal, she will vastly outlive her friends, which is, something that happens in a lot of fantasy. Like, this is a trope that has been played with. But it's easier to internalize that feeling when we can realize that if we were friends with Chilchuck, we would only have 20 years left on that friendship, since, he would turn 50 and die of old age. Other than that, Half-Foots have a childlike appearance similar to Tasselhoff, but this is contrasted against their personalities. Chilchuck is the grouch and cynic of the group. I really like this as a subversion in a couple ways. First off, halflings are usually optimists and the fun person of the group, especially with Kender, which I feel like Half-Foots are kind of a play on. So having Chilchuck in an opposite role flips this dynamic. But also, in universe, the character that looks like a kid having the personality of a depressed middle-aged man is just fun. In the world of Delicious and Dungeon, Half-Foots mostly keep to their own communities due to the obvious safety concerns of living alongside humans, an entire race of people that could beat Half-Foots in a fight one-on-one. The ones like Chilchuck who live in human communities are subject to discrimination. They are assumed to be untrustworthy. Half-foot adventurers are forced into the lock-picking trap finder role because they're not good at fighting, and their nimble fingers and sharp senses make them good for the role. Speaking of those senses, they have exceptional hearing. How could they not with those massive listeners? In all seriousness, I do like the big ears. A visual distinction, so halflings don't just look like humans, is important, and the looks like a human kid thing is not quite enough for me, so I like the big ears. Half-foots probably have more interesting things to talk about, but I guess we'll find out when Season 2 comes out. If I'm making my own halflings, or halfling analogs, I have a pretty robust history to pick and choose traits from. As I've alluded to, I think halflings have a surprising amount of continuity in their history with ghosts and the idea of being out of phase. I would encourage any writers out there to consider going really hard in this direction. I only included it a little bit. Another direction I didn't take halflings is that logically they should be absolutely cracked as sailors. Being small is an advantage in the close quarters of a ship, and being light and dexterous is helpful when climbing around on ropes and things. I think this would be a really fun idea for a D&D setting that doesn't want to change too much about the lore. You could have a halfling pirate crew. Can you imagine a D&D party getting chased down by a halfling pirate ship, and then the halflings all come flooding out, and there's twice as many as you can expect because they don't need as much space? But I did want to maintain the Shire aesthetic, so I didn't go with that one. The direction I wanted to go in was to investigate the childlike aspect that halflings have been flirting with for a while, but not really committed to, even with the Kender. After all, it suits halflings to have a childlike sense of innocence if they have a halfling luck feature, which they will in my version. But what happens if something bad happens to a halfling and they lose that innocence? What happens if the eternal children are forced to grow up? Now, if we're going to make our own fantasy race, we need a world to put them in. So let's make one up for the video. And then if I continue this series, I'll populate it with other takes on different entries in the series. But since we're starting a fresh world with halflings as the initial focus, I had a fun idea. The world of Fairyfall has a history that spans thousands of years, but its current state is largely defined by a single event. There used to be small magic spirits everywhere of all types, like in Celtic or East Asian traditions, but a magical catastrophe caused them all to either disappear or turn into mundane creatures, mostly animals with magical qualities. However, one type of spirit, the Hob, got turned into two intelligent races. Hobbs were small household spirits who could turn invisible and change their form. Some of them assisted in tasks around the house without the homeowner knowing. Some of them were more mischievous and used their shape changing to look like horrible, ugly faces to scare people. On the day that spirits, became unspirited, called the Unfair Day, Hobbs turned into one of two different races, goblins and hoblings. I think it's really fun to make a connection to Hobbs. After all, even if Tolkien didn't intend for there to be a connection between his hobbits and Hobbs, he based his hobbits off of the Snergs, which are, in universe, a descendant of English pixies. So my hoblings are a descendant of Hobbs. I also like the idea of goblins having this same origin story. After all, goblins are kind of weird in a lot of fantasy worlds, like where did they come from? So I'll talk more about goblins if I ever do a video on them, obviously. But for now, I think that's a fun seed to plant and see what happens later. As for hoblings, I wrote a whole document describing their many traits. In universe, this is a wizard's account of the different creatures of the world, which he is writing under duress from a dark lord that has come back and demanded to know what the world is like now. You can read the whole thing. The document is linked in the description, but I'll give you the highlights. Hoblings look childlike until their 20s, in which case they age roughly at the same rate as humans. However, they stop growing at about 12 years old. I'll read you a couple selected passages about their physical description. There are many ways other than their height that hoblings distinguish themselves from humans. Their eyes are large, twice as large as a human's. Their voices are not always high, but they will never be as low as the more gravelly throated parts of humanity. Hobbling men cannot grow hair on the lip or chin unless they have dwarf ancestry. Their hair and eyes are in bright colors which change constantly. An angry hobling's hair and eyes will turn red, while they turn blue for sadness and yellow for fear. Most hoblings will be happy when you meet them, and their hair and eyes will be a bright lime green to reflect it. With effort, hoblings can turn their hair and eyes any color they please, including the human colors. This is thought to be a last vestige of the shape-shifting powers of their fair ancestors. This chromatic shifting of the hair and eyes is not universal. The sorrowful Hoblings have white hair and pale gray eyes, which I will get to in due time. So if you're wondering about the sorrowful, that was my play on a ghostly subrace. So my Hoblings, if something horrible happens to them, they see what they call the haunt hound. They lose their Hobling luck, their hair turns white, their eyes turn light gray, and they gain the ability to turn invisible and intangible. You'll notice this is not the idea that Hoblings have to turn into adults, they're more turning into edgy teenagers. I think this would be a fun way of reclaiming the edgy rogue archetype from, sexy humans. Obviously, this isn't sexy. They're still like, they look like children, but they're like goth children. And I think that's cool. I think it's a fun design idea. There's a lot more to it. If you have some spare time, I encourage you to go into the description and read the document. It's about 10 pages, but with a lot of line breaks. If you enjoyed it, or especially if you didn't enjoy it, please let me know in the comments. I do want to do more of these in the future, including the little Word document world building project, and I want to know what I can do better. Also, if you have any ideas for creative spins on other fantasy races, or if you just want to hear about other fantasy races and you have a suggestion for what to do next, let me know. I right now think I'm going to do dwarves next, but I am not ready. This video took so long to make. I got burned out like pretty badly in the beginning of the summer, and then I had a lot of personal stuff going on that prevented me from finishing the script, even though there were multiple times that I really thought I was close to finishing. Like if you go through my post history, every time I posted a poll that involved halflings, that I thought I was a week away from releasing this video, and by God, that did not happen. So yeah, I'm not gonna do one of these for a while, but it was a lot of fun, so I will do one eventually. Probably. I don't know. If this video does really well, then I'll do one soon.